I'd like to describe the analogy of the chariot, which is a powerful metaphor from the Katha Upanishad. So the analogy is the chariot, the charioteer, the horses, the reins, and the passenger. And it describes the structure of the human mind, body and soul, and how they interact in the process of life and spiritual realization. This analogy is used to explain the relationship between the self, the Atman, the mind, the senses, and the intellect. Let's break down the elements and their corresponding symbolism. The chariot represents the physical body. It's the vehicle through which the self navigates the world of experiences and action. Just as the chariot moves from one place to another, the body serves as the vehicle for the soul's journey through life, carrying it through different circumstances and stages of existence. The charioteer represents the intellect, which is responsible for guiding the journey, just as the charioteer directs the horses and determines the direction the chariot should move. The intellect guides our actions, decisions, and understandings. The intellect is supposed to have control over the senses and mind, using wisdom and reason to make decisions in line with what is best for the individual. The reins symbolize the mind, which connects the intellect, the charioteer, to the senses, the horses. The mind is responsible for controlling and directing the senses, just as reins control the movement of the horses. The mind can either follow the direction of the intellect or allow the senses to take control. If the reins are well held, the horses, senses, follow the charioteer's, intellect's, guidance. If not, they can run wild, leading the chariot astray. So the horses represent the senses, which are the faculties that pull the chariot, the body, towards external objects. The senses include sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. If the horses are untrained or wild, they will pull the chariot in all directions, chasing after sensory pleasures and distractions. However, when the horses are well disciplined and under control, they obey the charioteer and follow the right path. So now we come on to the fifth element of this analogy, and the most important one: the passenger. The passenger seated in the chariot represents the true self, the Atman, the eternal soul that is beyond the mind, body, and intellect. The Atman is the ultimate observer, enjoying the ride but not actively involved in directing the chariot. The passenger is the essence of who we truly are, the pure, unchanging consciousness. While the Atman remains unaffected by the world, it relies on the proper functioning of the body, mind, and intellect for its journey through life. So to summarize, we have the chariot, which is the body, the physical vehicle; the charioteer, which is the intellect, the reasoning and guiding force; the reins, which is the mind, the connector and controller of the senses; the horses, the senses themselves, which pull the body towards sensory objects; and finally the passenger, the self or Atman, that is the true eternal soul. So we can interpret the analogy like this: in life, for the soul, the Atman, to reach its destination, which is spiritual realization or liberation, the charioteer, the intellect, must have firm control over the reins, the mind, which in turn should effectively manage the horses, senses. If the intellect is weak or the mind is scattered, the senses will take control, leading the person astray into indulgence, confusion, and ignorance. If the charioteer is strong, the reins are steady, the horses are disciplined, and the chariot will move smoothly towards the right goal, self-realization and spiritual liberation. mismanagement of the chariot. If the charioteer, the intellect, is distracted or ineffective, and the reins, the mind, are not held firmly, the horses, senses, will pull the chariot in random directions, chasing after fleeting sensory pleasures. In such a scenario, the true self, the Atman, will not be able to progress on the path to liberation, and the individual remains caught in the cycle of birth and death, samsara, driven by desires and attachments. Proper management of the chariot. To attain spiritual realization, the intellect must be wise, the mind calm and disciplined, and the senses well controlled. When all these elements function harmoniously, the soul moves steadily towards its ultimate goal, unity with Brahman, the supreme reality. This powerful analogy from the Upanishads illustrates the importance of mastering the mind and the senses in order to attain peace, self-realization and liberation. It underscores the need for proper balance and guidance of our inner faculties, enabling us to navigate life's challenges in harmony with our true nature. So I've read that analogy out literally word for word. I think the important part there is that most people can recognize and relate to four of those elements: the chariot, the charioteer, the mind and the senses. So the chariot, the charioteer, the reins and the horses. But the fifth element is the most important, which is the passenger, and that is the mystery. That is the unknowable essence of what we are. That is the indefinable element that doesn't lend itself to being named and seen. In the chariot analogy, it is all those elements of the chariot and none of them. It is not really located in space and time. It is the mystery of self itself, the Atman. And it's important to realize that although it seems to be a passenger, it isn't affected by what is happening. It is the ultimate observer in this sense. Sometimes we point to consciousness or pure awareness as the passenger in our own lives. It comes before the story. It isn't involved in where the senses are going and what is happening, and they move towards or away from external forms. It is other than those things. It is beyond them. It is a transcendent aspect of the self, of the self, small s, the psychophysical entity, the mind-body unit. And this analogy beautifully illustrates the thing in the mirror, the body, and what is happening there, and how we need to have proper control and proper actions, and how we should act according to our higher nature when we interact with the life around us and the manifestations that are in the relative world. But beyond that, there is the passenger, and the passenger isn't touched by any of that, and it is what we are. That is the eternal nature, the soul, the transcendent aspect of oneself. So, as with all analogies, this has its limitations, but it is a wonderful articulation of what is happening in the mind-body unit, the thing in the mirror, and how the passenger or the soul seems to be inextricably linked to that relative and physical entity, but isn't actually relative or physical. It is transcendent and divine.